Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to day 3, and I have mixed feelings the last day. So thank you all for being here, and we will now get to the much awaited policy roundtable. We have an excellent lineup for this, and we can see already. I will quickly introduce the chair for the policy roundtable, Anuradha Seth. She's a senior economist with 30 years of experience working on development policy and programs at the United Nations. Her primary areas of expertise include inclusive growth and macroeconomic policy, labor market and employment policy, poverty and inequality, with a focus on gender across these thematic areas. She joined the UN in 2016, where she led the global team on macroeconomics and gender, and spearheaded the organization's work on the care economy. She has co-led strategic initiatives in the UN systems, including co-chairing the UN agency, Task Force on Inclusive and Sustainable Growth, and full and productive employment of the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically Goal 8. Prior to joining UN Women, Anuradha was chief of the Inclusive and Green Growth session at UNDP and an assistant professor of economics at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. She has widely published, including recent publications, Engendering Fiscal Space, a Policy Framework, and co-edited with Diana Elson, Gender Equality and Inclusive Growth, Economic Policies to Achieving Sustainable Development. Thank you so much, Anuradha, for chairing the session for us today, and I give the floor to you to take it from here.
Thanks so much, Ashma. Just one qualification there. I was with the UN. I retired out last year. So, and it has been a blessing ever since, you know. Well, it's a pleasure to kickstart today's session. We will be looking really at policy issues in today's discussion at this round table. So let me begin by introducing our panelists very quickly, and then we get started. Valeria Escobar is an internationally recognized feminist economist from Argentina. She has been with the ILO since 2016, where she leads the design and implementation of gender-responsive employment policies. Her work about the care economy and transformative care policies has been particularly influential, as we all know. And she's currently working to strategically position gender-responsive policies in various domains within the ILO, including through investments in care services. Valeria is an elected member of the board and the executive board of IAFI. She's an associate editor for Feminist Economics and is member of the editorial advisory group of Gender and Development. So I'm going to introduce each panelist and have them actually go for their presentation.
Okay.
We'll go one.
Thank you. So you don't have the titles of what we are planning to say, and this is my title: Care Policies at the Global and National Level, New Framings and New Action. And I prepared a PowerPoint presentation only because I have text, in fact, quotes from different global documents, and I wanted you to have them afterwards and also to read with me if you would. And this is because these words matter. They are agreements. And in particular, I will mention and build my argument on 2 of these documents. The Buenos Aires Commitment, which was the agreement reached at the end of 2022 by the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean, the result of the 15th Regional Conference on Women for Latin America and the Caribbean. And then recently, the agreed conclusions of the International Labour Conference general discussion on decent work and the care economy. And first of all, what is my objective? Show you how feminist economics, and in particular, how feminist heterodox economics has influenced these discourses. How, in my view, we did the homework and we got our language at this agreement level. And with that, I think that we then can think of ways on which these international agreements can be translated into action at the country level, which is where the action, in fact, has to be. So the Buenos Aires commitment. First, a movement that we've seen also in the human rights sphere as well, the recognition of care as a right to provide and receive care and to exercise self-care based on the principles of equality, universality, and social and gender co-responsibility. You will see then that in the ILC ILO discussion, you will have all this. That's why I prepared the PowerPoint, so no problem. The care as a right didn't quite make it because the idea was, but there is something very similar out there as well. Then some point 6 emphasizes something that is a creation of Latin America, which is the idea of comprehensive care systems. The agenda in Latin America on care progressed very much in the last few years, last decade, I would say. Initially, and I've written about that at the time, it was a very top-down north-south agenda. And then it was taken on board, part of the expansion and strengthening of the feminist movement in the region, and it has, in fact, feed into international conversations in ways that were not there. I have to say, and that is public information today, nowadays, that the Latin America group, the GRULEC, in the ILC discussion was extremely important in pushing the agenda progressively. Then you have setbacks because everything is an agreed conclusion. But if you put it like there, then you end up somewhere better than if you don't have those positions. So the idea of comprehensive care systems that bring up decent work and full, significant and equal participation of women in position of leadership in a strategic sector of the economy for transformational recovery with gender equality. So this sectoral idea that it's not only matter, the structural transformation idea is also there. And then design, implement, and evaluate macroeconomic policies, particularly fiscal policies, from a gender equality and human rights perspective, with a view to increase sustainable public investment over time in care policies and infrastructure. So again, very clear agenda. And why? Because we understand the multipliers effects of boosting the care economy in terms of labor market participation by women in their diversity, of well-being, redistribution, economic growth, and the macroeconomic impact of the care economy, and it goes on. So again, we've been building this case for quite some time, and it's now there in an agreed conclusion. The decent work and the care economy agreed conclusions. This is June this year. Seems like ages. It says it defines care work in ways that we know, and it takes this twist. You know, it's 80 years since the Declaration of Philadelphia in 1944, and Shayati was there in the commemoration of that anniversary. And the conclusion said, just as labor is not a commodity, labor in the care economy is not a commodity. So this is putting all labor, care labor, in fact, that is the language, both paid and unpaid, at the same level of what Philadelphia had in 1944. So it was a very, I mean, it was super debated, but when the Philadelphia was put there, it was when consensus, I mean, no one can say something against a constitution. So it was when consensus was brought up. And then it says, it doesn't say care is a right, but it says all people should be able to provide and receive care, including self-care, and all workers should enjoy decent work. Then the state has a primary responsibility for care provision, funding, regulation, and ensuring high standards of quality, safety, and health for care workers and care recipients. And this includes the allocation of the necessary resources and adoption and maintenance of a robust policy and regulatory framework. The state has primary responsibility. We've been talking about public investments in care, but we didn't have such a strong language before, and therefore the agreement is that governments should design and implement integrated and coherent care policies and systems for decent work and gender equality. So these are the objectives. And these policies should contribute to a rights-based approach for care and be grounded in international labor standards, those of course cannot be missing, and social dialogue. The 5R framework: recognize, reduce, redistribute, and represent and reward care work, both unpaid and paid, provides invaluable guidance in this regard. So, and this is, I think, yeah, my previous to last. So in the ILO conclusions, investments in the care economy promotes many good things, and therefore governments should promote employment and macroeconomic policies that create decent jobs in the care economy. Like, it cannot be misinterpreted, no? It's like very, very clear, including through the formalization of informal care jobs and enterprises, the prevention of informalization of formal ones, and ensuring sufficient fiscal space. So we have a very clear and agreed agenda. And for us, at least for me, that means that I can progress on this work knowing that that is an agreement. It's not just that we want it. It was agreed and a tripartite agreement. So what is the way forward at the country level? And perhaps we can have a debate about this. And I think that is on the one side, progress on care policies, in particular, I think the Latin American model, the national care systems, can help, in particular in southern and less developed countries. And then the debates, I mean, moving forward on financing and fiscal space, the demand side, do I have a minute? One. Okay, the demand side considerations you are all aware, but I wanted to make a note and expand the fiscal space, but I wanted to make a note on supply side considerations because we've been talking about that. And I wanted to tell you, and it's published in one article, that we did a modelization of in a heterocompatible computable general equilibrium model in which we put the expansion of the same hypothesis. In fact, we have in 2018 the expansion of health and education sectors, and also some productivity, positive productivity impacts like savings in hours because people and improve education. And the interesting thing in this model that was run by colleagues at Cambridge is that in order, when we were evaluating whether the demand side or the supply side impacts were more important, in developed countries, the supply impact, the productivity enhancing impacts were relatively more important than demand side impacts. And the other way around for our countries, it was really the impact of demand that mattered. So we can keep on using input-output models because those are capturing the impacts that really matter in our economies that are not necessarily at full employment and limited by labor. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Valeria. Our next speaker, Mary Borman, is a policy fellow at CGD, Center for Global Development, in the Gender Equality and Inclusion Program. Before joining CGD, Mary was a senior economist at the International Center for Research on Women, which included serving as the technical lead for We Prosper, a global coalition for women's economic empowerment. Mary's prior experience has included work for UNIDO, which is the UN Industrial Development Organization, in conjunction with the Rutgers Center for Women and Work, the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis, and the Brooks World Poverty Institute. She holds a PhD in economics from the New School. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm honored for the opportunity to share reflections with you today on this policy roundtable and hopefully set the seeds for discussion. And from where I sit in my perspective, and that is very much at the global level, I'm in a think tank now in Washington, D.C., focused on global development. And I continue to engage in policy and advocacy spaces on care. So for context, as I shared yesterday, I was so lucky to by chance end up at a university with a heterodox economics program and get introduced to feminist economics there, particularly in the context of international development by Gisela Berry. And then pursued that through my PhD. But then, transitioning kind of from a research role, I started my previous position during COVID, which was, as a senior economist at ICRW. And coming from this feminist economics background since I was an undergrad, it was so remarkable to see care work so present in global policy dialogues. And this was consistently the top issue that our membership of this coalition that was mentioned wanted to engage in. So in that role at ICRW, as mentioned, I sat as a technical lead for this global coalition on women's economic empowerment. This had 65 members from across the globe, including regional and global civil society organizations, international NGOs, grassroots organizations, women-led and feminist groups, academic institutions, private sector, really brought together the research and the advocacy from country to global level to really see how we could make change. And as someone with a research background, I used to joke that this was my crash course on advocacy, this experience. But it really was this amazing learning experience for me. And now I continue policy engagement on women's economic empowerment in my current role, and particularly care continues to be an issue. My role now is a bit different in that my engagement is often more with international financial institutions, which has some challenges that I'll get to. And today what I've been asked to in terms of my topic is to reflect on the global policy and advocacy landscape for care in terms of both gaps and where we can see opportunities going forward. And so I will say, during this time, we have seen, programs and financing and commitments from international financial institutions, donor governments, multilateral fora from the UN, from national governments. But I would say, what has been a struggle is that a lot of these are not binding in the commitments. The transparency is really lacking, and accountability is often very, very difficult to track any of this, of what's actually getting financed, of what the impacts are, of even what's being spent on care at national levels. And I think the topics have been quite narrow as well. Where we have seen the most momentum is definitely on childcare, and much more, I would say, than for elder care for those with disabilities. And I think some of this is very reflective of what's often been effective in terms of framing. What seems to have worked, and I think we all, for those of us as economists, know this is important, but can feel that make me squirm too, is that it's the return on investment type of argument, right? And so the stimulation of the work of EPAC and others has been really powerful for this. But some of that with childcare is really rooted in this, like, you're investing in the human capital of the future. And that's compelling and that's important. But then when we get to elder care, the argument isn't quite the same, but the needs are obviously just as important, right? And the logic of that. So, and then there's also has been a focus, I would say, on infrastructure investments overall, but these aren't always designed with the time use of women and considerations for their safety, such as water and fuel collection in mind. So, as I teased in my remarks yesterday, what I would say is I do not think we are facing a decreased importance of care by any means, nor do I think that we've seen the kind of programmatic and policy change that has led us to these kind of sustainable systems that are creating, care economies that are really going to put forth inclusive development. I think we've seen incremental change. I think things are sustainably financed that are going to, create something that's going to be ongoing. And instead, I think we're facing a multitude of crises that will only intensify the importance of care going forward. And as I said, childcare needs, the area where we've seen the most momentum in low and middle income countries. There's still such huge gaps in terms of needs. And as I said, I think that the way that they've been funded often isn't creating something that's really sustainable, or where there are national policies, financing really does remain a challenge. as does quality often, and then the conditions of wages and conditions for care workers as well. Also, I think, fiscal and debt crises, we're looking at reductions in access to public services that are going to increase care. We're seeing dramatic demographic changes that we know are going to increase the importance of elderly care. That her paper yesterday was so important. And there's less research on this in low and middle income countries as well as on the kind of disability aspects of needs. And we also know that this brings up really important issues of labor supply and demand. We're going to face dramatic worker shortages and really need care workers. And then that brings up a very politically touchy subject of migration, right? How are we thinking about meeting those care needs? And then what does that imply for how we need to think about protecting care workers and putting those types of things in place? We also know that the climate crisis is going to, intensify needs for, potentially time for water and fuel collection, and also that in combination with other conflict is creating a lot of displacement. And there's just not a lot of research and work done on what works to meeting care needs in FCB context. Been doing some research on this recently, and it's been surprising. There isn't a lot of literature out there, and a lot of kind of donors aren't engaging in this space because they're just really not sure what works. So in the women's economic empowerment space overall, I would say there's much more focus from donors and funders on micro-based interventions as well, and programs and policies, and really with the focus on getting women into markets. And where it has been more of a challenge is on the macro aspects, which I'm sure all of you here can really, commiserate with, and yet we know that these are absolutely essential, because without changes at this level, creating inclusive economic systems and development processes is important, or is impossible. We're just not going to really be able to, get the resources and things that we need. And so I think that the research that Zia presented on Tanzania and Luis on Brazil yesterday at the Input-Output panel was powerfully illustrative of evidence for the two key parts of creating care-centered inclusive structural change and development. And I love your kind of introduction to structural change importance. And that's one piece, which is the reallocation of resources within existing fiscal space. And the second is, how are we finding ways to expand fiscal space? And this requires engaging with policymakers, economists, finance ministers, and international financial institutions, and not just with gender equality and social ministries that are probably already on board with these issues. And this is hard, I would say, and especially international financial institutions, I think, can be quite difficult to permeate because sometimes the perspectives are quite different. The kind of underlying thinking and the models used are quite different. But it's a very important space, and I think it's where we need to reflect on how to move forward. It'll say in the global advocacy landscape, international movements for care, I think, are very dynamic. I think we've seen so much research and advocacy come together across sectors, including women's economic empowerment, but then also early childhood development, labor movements such as domestic workers and unions, and across issue areas, including a new and growing area of the care and climate nexus, which I think is really interesting and important. So, and with this advocacy movement, I think there is really an acknowledgement of the importance of macro issues and a real hunger and interest in engaging, and a real want, honestly, to engage, particularly with heterodox feminist economists on this. And I think there have been initiatives by many here, IIFP Summer School, other things, there's Economics, that are really looking to start bridging that. And I think even donors such as Hewlett have identified this as like a really critical area where we need to start building knowledge transfer and exchange that's just not there right now. So I think that's kind of a call to action for all of us to see how we can engage and help, facilitate this. I also think, something I think about in terms of being a chair of IIFP's online events committee, we kicked off a macro track and hope to work with all of you to bring some of that forward in the future. And we've seen some exciting initiatives. The Global Alliance for Care is something that was started by women in the government of Mexico through the Generation Equality Forum. It has governments as members, as well as civil society, philanthropists, a lot of different members. But again, what we're lacking is the kind of binding commitment. So we need to think about, we're going to use what's come out of this great momentum on care to push things forward. Because ultimately, I think right now we're at a very pivotal time for care work globally. And that is because we're risking losing momentum without seeing the type of transformational change that could drive more sustainable and inclusive development processes and ultimately really change economic systems. And the biggest risk I see is that there's so much focus right now within international development policy and finance shifts to climate. It's starting to drown everything out. I think we're, trying to still get gender in a lot of the agendas, but especially to get, continue to get care. People are still talking about it, but we just haven't seen the actual action that we need. And a lot of what's happening, I'm very much looking forward to the gender and climate panel later today, but I think even the way gender is being brought into climate is often quite minimal, often micro-focused, and really, we're lacking some of the kind of ways to again track and keep accountable where that's going and have an idea of what's working where. So I think again, as we think about the pivotal time, the fiscal space constraints, particularly with so many countries that are at risk of debt crises, this is a really crucial time for us to make sure that these things don't fall off the agenda, and then we're again coming up with solutions about how we can counter those pressures on fiscal space. And it's a pivotal time because things like industrial policy are back in the mix, right? Suddenly we're able to talk about this again, which was kind of not something we were supposed to talk about for a very long time. And I think we need to think about what gender responsive industrial policy looks like, as well as sectoral policy. And a lot of the people who are in those spaces are not thinking about gender, let alone care, right? And so there's kind of this disconnect, I think, in that, as well as thinking about this kind of just green transition, right? That's often not something that's also incorporating this aspects of gender and care. And Mina, I was very excited about your paper yesterday, as I thought it was bringing in this, trade and structural change work that I think is so important. But ultimately, and I think I'm probably coming to the end of my time, is that, this is all going to require us to find entry points with those coming from different theoretical perspectives, who view the economy completely differently than us, and to engage in the work of determining where there's room to change minds and where there isn't. And that's challenging. But I'll end by bringing together some insights shared from two heterodox feminist economists I greatly admire. The first is something that I often think about that keeps me going in my own work when I feel defeated or impatient, and it's something that James Heinz remarks at the closing plenary of the AIP conference in Geneva said, and that is, how are we going to hold a long-run vision for transformational change while also valuing and not discounting the importance of incremental change? And the second is what Valeria articulated so well when we were talking the other day, and that is how, when we have this vision of care systems and care economies, that can change the agenda for the incremental change we're seeking. So, how are we creating this long-run thing, and then how is that guiding incremental change what we're pushing for in the short run? So I think the work of this group of scholars here and part of this historical community has really developed that in a rigorous way. I'm again so honored to be here. And that puts together the integral macro pieces that will be critical to ensuring we create more inclusive development that is centered on care and sustainability.
Our third speaker, Raquel Lagunas, is the Global Director of Gender Equality at UNDP, based in New York with more than 25 years of experience working on gender equality in different development settings. She has advised governments across the world and large development organizations, has worked closely with NGOs and grassroots women's movements across Latin America. Raquel is also the co-founder of America Latina Genera, a unique knowledge management platform that promotes gender equality across the region. Raquel has also worked closely with academia.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to our colleagues from the Levitt Institute. It's really a pleasure to be surrounded by these knowledgeable colleagues. Many of you know UNDP, but just in case, I will frame one line of our work. We definitely concentrate our efforts in eradicating poverty in more than 170 countries and territories. And of course, we cannot do this without integrating gender equality at the center of our work. So we work in different aspects of macroeconomy, UNDP, such as the financing dimension, the work on the alien affairs. We support countries in the redesigning of the public debt, but also strengthening the taxation systems. So the topic of fiscal policies for gender equality, that is the topic of my conversation today, is at the core of our work. And I think, I see here, I need to mention you, Jajati, because you know us, and she has been accompanying us in this path. And I wanted to also recognize the contribution of the feminist economists, first of all, like Karen Brown, like IPEC that is here. So whatever I'm going to say now is going to be always, and it has been enriched and guided by them. And that's how UNDP thinks we should work and embed feminist economics in at least in our organization. So for UNDP, what is public finance? Public finance is at the core of the social contract. And I can mention Joseph Stiglitz when he said, it enables the democratic determination of priorities. So the public finance is at the core of democracies. And we think that definitely we need, and the work that we need to are concentrating now is expanding, helping countries to expand the fiscal space. So let me share with you some data that you may have already coming from UN Women. 360 billion per year is needed to achieve gender equality, SDG 5. While at the same time, 50% of the population only controls 2% of the global wealth. While 10% of the population, top 10% of the population controls 76% of the wealth. So there is a big problem of the distribution of wealth. Which are the challenges for middle-income countries, and I would say also for high-income countries, but let's talk about middle-income countries and low-income countries from our perspective as practitioners, as development practitioners. So we see, and we work in more than 90 countries on INFX and 45 on taxation. Definitely very limited capacities to collect taxes, regressive systems, where the rich and the big companies, multinational, are out of the picture, narrow tax base, tax avoidance and evasion, and I don't want to say weak, but definitely kind of the capacities of public administration and the ecosystem of financial institutions are really another challenge. The other one is trust, and the last one is debt distress, but I will not talk a lot about this last one because I think someone is going to talk later about this issue. So let me give you one example. The World Bank considers that taxes to be collected and invested by the government, invest in development should represent 15%. Haiti is just over 6%, Sudan 2%. And other challenge that they face, as I said, is trust. For instance, we saw in Kenya in summer, the big protest, massive protest on the streets because of the increase of and the raise of taxes. So at the same time, there is a correlation between higher tax revenues above 30 and 40% connected to higher rates or scores in the democracy index, connected to also high rates in the gender equality index. It's not a surprise, but it's a correlation that we need to keep putting on the table. And this includes also higher trust in the governments and in institutions, linked to citizen participation. So one retrofits the other. The other critical challenge that I mentioned is the debt distress and austerity measures. For instance, African countries' borrowing costs is 9.8%, compared to 2.5 in the USA or 0.8 in Germany. Women are the ones, and we all know that here, that are the ones subsidizing the economy in terms of austerity, as they take the bulk of the work on and paid care and social services. So what do we do with partners? For us, the fiscal policies have the power to change inequalities in general, but also gender inequalities in particular. So through this program that you mentioned, thank you, Economics, we are working in this direction, supporting already 23 countries, but more concentrated in 6, all the elements that I'm going to mention in 6, with ministries of finance, tax authorities, but also other actors like public banks and parliaments. So we don't forget the political dimension of all this conversation. So we are trying to connect, because we observe that there is fragmentation in this work, public revenue, taxation, to public expenditure, budgets, and public institutional reforms. This is also the third element, that can be the fifth. We go through some business terms kind of approach. the third element, public institutional reform, is so fundamental because many times what we have been investing is in ad hoc trainings, talking about parity at the top of public reform, but we don't talk about real reform for gender equality. And the last one, the politics. So let me mention the core elements of the program that are really beyond the program of UNDP, goals that we all ambition to see achieving in developing countries. First one, reduce poverty through reviewing the fiscal incidence. And here I have Ana Maria Trevin, who was before working with UNDP. I'll give you an example. She did a research on the fiscal, on the tax system of El Salvador, and the fiscal policy was making women clearly poorer, and the poverty rate of women increased from 22% to 26%, while the poverty rate of men increased slightly less. So this is one dimension that we think it will have an impact. If we help governments to understand the impact of the monetary taxation in women and men. Eliminating bias, gender bias in tax and budget reforms is the other priority area that we work, and we know well, and I think maybe Ipek will talk later, how, for instance, exceptions of taxes and fees to promote, for instance, registration of land in women's names has increased in Telangana state of India, women's ownership of the land. But not only in India, in Kosovo and Peru. In Peru it's pretty impressive. Over 40% of the titles issued with this program included women as sole owners. So really, we may think that the problems are huge, are big, are the monetary policy of countries, is the international financing system, but this issue of incremental structural changes is really relevant, and I think these are concrete examples to prove it. We accompany them, as I said, through internal reforms. I mentioned that legal reforms of tax and policy revision of midterm and annual fiscal planning, capacity development of women's organizations and civil society. So we need to connect definitely more dots than concentrated in tax system reforms and political consensus. We open this conversation. Just to close, we organized in Istanbul a global dialogue on fiscal policies for gender equality, funded by Hewlett, by the way, with 180 participants, 40 country delegations. There is appetite, there is a need. Countries understand that they need to strengthen the fiscal policies. And some conclusions that we learned and we got from this dialogue. Countries are really very far from alignment the national goals to their own fiscal objectives. There is a huge gap. There is insufficient understanding of the impact of their own fiscal policies. There are no data, no assessments, impact assessment, and of course, even less differentiating the gender dimension. So political institution and institutional will is strong. So this is on our side. It's really strong. We saw this in Istanbul. It is critical to look together revenue and public expenditures. This is a big push coming also from Karen Brown, who is the advisor of our program. And I wanted to recognize her name here because she has been extremely generous and of course, knowledgeable. So, and in general terms, country needs to conduct this impact assessment, as I said. There is a need to bridge the institutional, the gap among institutions, and this is nothing new, but very important. Departments of ministries of finance very rarely talk and interact with the women's machineries, but also the social kind of ministries of labor, is very, very, very particular, this phenomenon. And open national policy dialogues is as important as to bring the technical work. Then there is no sex disaggregating data, surprise, surprise, and gender statistics are needed, very much on household composition, consumption patterns, or gender of taxpayers. In sum, and I will close here, with the reflection that fiscal policy and gender equality are not merely technical issues, not merely economic issues, are deeply political ones. And it influences how we organize our societies, our families, our day-to-day life, and both determine who has what, who has access to what, and who benefits from what. So happy to be here and continue the conversation with my colleagues.
Thank you, Rachel. And we have our final speaker this morning, Anna Maria Tribin, who is a senior economist at the World Bank's Development Economics Vice Presidency. She holds a doctorate in economics from Brown University. And before joining the World Bank, Anna worked at UNDP as a public policy specialist and led the gender team. She has also served as a senior research economist at the Central Bank of Colombia and as the president's national advisor for women's equality in the Colombian government. Anna co-founded the Research Action Project Digna, focused on gender equality at the University de Los Andes. Her research centers on gender, migration, and development economics. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk about data. Just one thing about my bio in the UNDP, I was the team leader in charge of the Latin American gender team. Well, so I'm going to talk about the woman business and the law data. A lot of the conversation here has been pointing out that there's no enough data in gender. And I think this is a very good time to present some data that is publicly available and it has a lot of information. So I'm going to talk today about this data that we just released in March this year. We are analyzing the legislation of 190 countries and identifying exactly the barriers for women to advance professionally. So you can just go to the webpage and see what laws are missing for each country. This is data that we gathered from the scratch. So this is new data that help us to understand what are the barriers in the paper for women. So as everyone in this room knows, women around the world face critical challenges to their livelihoods. They have a lot of challenges trying to balance work and family. Also, there's a lot of barriers to enter in the labor force. Just 50% of women are participating in the labor force, while men participate in 80%. And other data is that 1 out of 3 businesses are owned by women. So we can see that there's a lot of disparities, and it's key to understand with data what is really happening. So we have been collecting data, and we have data available since 1970. So you can track all reforms that countries have been making. This year we enhanced the data, so I'm going to show you the old data and the new data. So with the old data, what we have is in each of these areas that we think are key for the economic empowerment of women, we have in each of these areas a set of laws that we think are key for women to have equal rights, compared with women. So we have laws in mobility, workplace, payment, marriage, parenthood, entrepreneurship, assets, and pensions. So we have all this data, and here I'm showing all the reforms and you can see that there's an improvement of the improvement in the laws that are advocating for gender equality, but it's super interesting what is happening with workplace. Workplace is all the laws related with discrimination in the workplace. And you can see that since 2000, this one started to be very popular and countries started to legislate to reduce, to prohibit discrimination against women in the workplace. If you look at other other areas inside each of these indicators, for example, in parenthood we have leave for mothers and for fathers. If you look at the leave for mothers, you can also see inside of this one, if you just check that component, that there's also an expansion of these laws to give women around 14 weeks for maternity leave. And that was a big success for ILO. What we see in the other hand with fathers is that there's a lot of heterogeneity. So this is going to show you what is happening with rights and laws during all this period of time. Now we have a new index, and our index is evolving over time. So we are all here piloting new topics, because the rights and the laws, like sometimes you start to see that there's something new that people need to be equal. So for example, this year we're piloting an indicator for taxes and gender budgeting to see what is there, what is the legislation there. And you can see that there's, as Raquel was saying, that there's a lot of countries are legislating about this, but there's a lot of heterogeneity. The concept, even the concept of gender budgeting is different from country to country. We are also piloting another one in health and reproductive rights. But after piloting safety and childcare, we decided to include them in the index, because these two topics, as we have been talking here, are key for the development, professional development of women. So in safety, for example, we have whether the countries have femicide laws against femicide, a comprehensive laws against domestic violence, laws in child marriage, and also sexual harassment. Super interesting that most of the countries have legislation about sexual harassment at work, but not in public services. For childcare, we started to see the laws that are linked to availability, affordability, and quality of childcare services. And this is also something new that the countries are looking, because they are forming these systems of care. So we are getting all the information of what they are really doing at the legislative level. Thank you. So what we find is that with the inclusion of these two areas, we only have 2/3 of the necessary laws to achieve gender equality. So there's still a lot of way to go, and even the countries that have higher levels of gender equality, they still need to legislate to promote more gender equality in their countries. So I wanted to show you the data. This is comparing the old index with the new index, and we can see that including childcare and safety, all the countries are worst off. And the only one that is not worst is Panama. Panama has a very good set of laws for childcare and safety. And if you look at the regions, you can see, for example, that now Middle East and North Africa only have 39% of the laws necessary to achieve equality. Looking at the specific areas, we can see that in safety, we have only 36% of the laws necessary there. And in this one, for example, it was interesting that the ones that are missing are the ones for child marriage. So there's like 139 countries without the necessary laws for prevent child marriage. Entrepreneurship is also another one that has a lower score, and childcare, and especially in childcare, the topic is quality. There's no, in most of the countries, there are laws about affordability and access, but not about quality. And as a mom, myself, when you don't know if it's a good quality, you are going to like decide to take over the care. So that is going to impact women decisions. Looking at sometimes we get this comment that, well, sometimes laws are just in the paper and they don't reflect in reality. But the reality is that if in the paper you have barriers, it's going to be very difficult for women to have equality. So if we are working in an agenda, looking at the relations between laws and social norms, looking at laws and climate change, we're working also in laws, in entrepreneurship, and what are their role. So here I wanted to show you just some correlations between our legal score and labor force participation, and our legal score with unemployment, and with firms with female participation in ownership. And we can see that there's a positive correlation between women economic empowerment and good laws that improve the rights for women. The other thing we did this time is that it's not just about the laws. You need a whole bundle of things that comes with the law for the law to have an impact, no? So for each law, we started to see whether there's enough budget, if there's an institution, if there's a program, if there's a policy, if there's data. And with this, we constructed another index. So with that index, we only find that 40% of the supporting frameworks are in place for these laws to become reality. And in the ones that we find that the number of supporting frameworks are lower, are workplace, assets, childcare, pay, parenthood. Workplace, remember that workplace started to, like a lot of countries started to reform on workplace, but what we see is that, for example, there's no an institution where you can go and complain about a discrimination. So without that, it's impossible for the law to be enforced. So here you can see the two measures, the measure about the laws and the measure about the supporting framework. And you can see that they move together, but the supporting framework are lag behind because it needs more resources. And finally, we wanted not just to know about the law, the supporting frameworks, but also what is happening in reality. So we were asking our experts. We have lawyers all around the world helping us to understand what is happening with the laws and with the policies, and we asked them their perception on the rights of women. And they were saying that only 2/3 of women enjoy the same rights as men. That is similar to what we found for the laws. And the most challenging areas are safety and childcare. And here you can see the 3 components. We're still working in the expert opinion, and we're piloting surveys that are representative at the national level, playing with vignettes for the experts. We're doing a lot of things to get more information about that. But I wanted just to, I think I don't have time, but just for you to check this. And the light blue is the expert opinion score. Look at the Middle East and North Africa. Even though these experts are telling us that there's no laws, like enough laws, there's no enough policies and budget, but the things are okay. So this is super interesting. What is happening behind? Maybe social norms are the ones that are playing there. And that's happened, and it's different. If you look at the high income, they think that they are better off than they are. And this is in line with the paper of Leo Augustin that he was finding that in high income countries, they were like, well, we don't have to do more. Like everything is okay. We have enough rights for everyone. So I think that that all this information that we have here, like can in this group where you are exploring and analyzing data, will give a lot of information. So just to finish, here you can go there and find all the data and everything is available.
Thank you.
Thank you to all our wonderful panelists. We have, I think, about half an hour for a discussion, for Q&A. So before I pass the mic on to the audience, just a couple of reflections. We've been hearing really about, frameworks around the care economy, around macroeconomic issues and labor market. And it seems, and having worked on these issues also at the UN, it seems we are now at a point where there's pretty much, a good understanding at global levels, at least at the global level, on what a policy framework for care looks like. Like what needs to be done and how this should be addressed. You have it in some of the regions, particularly Latin America, which is the whole Buenos Aires commitment. But I'm not sure you have quite the same traction at the country level. And that is a serious issue. It has taken us very long to get this far in many countries. Yet when we go to several countries in Africa, basically the governments do not think the care issue is a policy priority right now. So there is a huge amount of work that still needs to be done to make the case for this in different regions of the world. The second issue invariably, because of course we have engaged with governments on doing the work, on doing the estimations of how much it is going to cost if we have to finance and scale up care services. And this is so much of the work that IPEC has supported us with, and we've done this with the ILO. And when you look at the numbers, because we have been doing this work with governments, not as a research exercise where we go present the results to government counterparts, but we have engaged the governments themselves to actually conduct these studies. And of course, when you look at the results, we're just estimating childcare costs can range from 3 to 5% of GDP. You already see their antennas, coming up. And the first question we're asked invariably is, well, how are we going to finance this? Where is the money? Which has brought us to the need and the importance of really looking at fiscal space issues. And here I think I'm very, I use the term fiscal space because to me it is a broader issue than just looking at fiscal policy or tax and expenditure policy. It is a wider kind of framework. You have to look at the issue of debt. You have to look at, first of all, why are countries fiscally squeezed? You have to look at the entire macro framework, including monetary policies. And as over the last year and a half, we have been doing this work on engendering fiscal space, I think a key issue that has come out is simply how inadequate the tools are out there from a gender perspective. When it comes to monetary policy, how are we informing that, for instance? When it comes to the issue of debt, are there gender, suppose you have debt relief, how do you take that money and channel it for gender programming, for instance? Where are those gender benchmarks, the gender markers? So there is still, when it comes to the macro side, we find a lot of resistance from government counterparts to embed gender firmly into macro strategies, including industrial policies, for instance. So that is still, somehow an issue we need to kind of tackle. We are trying to do it, all agencies, I think, through a lot of training and capacity development. And when it comes to the training, you will see that huge demand because we also have experienced that. But when it comes to implementation, the adaptation and the adoption at country levels, we still have a long ways to go. So I just want to leave it at that, and hope we can have some reflections on these as well, in terms of how do you round this work now? I think we're at the level where we're going beyond. We have global frameworks, we have those things. They're all over the place. But at the country level, we still deal sometimes with a little bit of messiness. Just take the issue of financing. It's a crowded field at the country level with multiple agencies doing multiple things. Even when it comes to gender, you'll have like 6 different kinds of costings from a gender perspective. And so there needs to be some kind of, cleaning up even on our own ends. But I'll stop there and open it up for discussion. Just put up your hands, and that's the first hand I see. Go ahead. Mina.
Thank you. I really want to thank everybody on the panel. It's great interventions. My points can be addressed by anyone on the panel, although I think Valeria and Raquel talked a lot, touched upon this, and I talked a lot about it. But also Ana Maria, when she was showing the data, and so it links to your point as well, when you said that we have these laws and everything, and when we see the effects, and I think the issue of enforcement is important, right? You touched upon it a little bit, but I think my question is if any one of you knows about some instruments that can be used to enforce the laws. And I mean, we have these laws and these agreements, which are great, and we need to do more, but it is like a drug, the legal stuff, right? A drug that cures a disease, and it would have passed all the approvals, and then the price is so exorbitant that nobody can buy it. And if it's not, if they're not going to get to it. And enforcement will allow people to get the benefits of laws and agreements. I give you a very simple example. A few years ago, Morocco introduced a legislation that protects young women working in homes, domestic, right? Because people, what they did in the past, many families would go to the countryside, get somebody who's 10 years old, bring the girl to the house, make her do incredible things of work and keep her there until she's like 24 or something, and then they send her back to her parents. The parents in the countryside get the money. The girl doesn't get any rights whatsoever. And we only know about abuses going on when there is a huge crime, and they cannot hide it, and it goes to courts and things like that. So my point is, could we add the fact that we need more women represented at the judiciary system so that enforcement can take place? Because in many cases, all the laws are not getting enforced. Recently, you talked about violence in the public sphere or at home or things like that. Morocco had a very bad case of a child being raped. 11 years old child who was raped, and it was multiple people, and the judge gave them sentences of 3 to 2 years. When people heard about that through social media, of course, they went to the streets, and the king had to intervene, and then they changed it to 30 years to life. So these things are important. So the issue of enforcement, I think all these agencies that work on gender issues should make enforcement part of all the agreements that go in. Otherwise, it's not going to be helpful to many women around.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Ipek, and then you, and then Marcela, and then we move back to the panelists.
Thank you for an excellent panel. Valeria, the Buenos Aires commitment was something that was led by UNECLAC, or the regional level UN initiatives. What can be done in order to have some of that work that's going on in Latin America to also make its way into other regional commissions, maybe through the regional economic and social commissions? Is there anything going on that front? And also, similarly with the ILO tripartite decisions that you went over, which are very interesting, what can be done or what will be done, what can be a strategy for having some country level traction, taking that from that international level to the national level. And also, I know Anu, before she retired from UN Women, she was working with the UNPSG on the UN system-wide paper on care. Like how is that paper speaking to these other UN level initiatives? So something I'm just putting it out there. Raquel, for economics interventions, where is employment generation? To what extent does employment generation play a role or hold a space in those discussions? And you also talked about how Ministry of Finance at the national level usually has coordination with Ministry of Labor and the Women's Machinery or Ministry for Social Policy. And one of the things we've been doing in Turkey, which I've been sort of involved, not in a leading manner, but on an invited manner, but to my delight, what's happening in the Turkish context is the UNDP country office, ILO country office, and UN Women country office came together for a coordinated initiative on fiscal policy and care economy, and that at the leading of the specialized UN agencies is really helping the various components of the government to come together and create that institutional coordination. So do you think that's something that can be replicated? Mary, thank you for bringing up industrial policies. I think so important. And in this full program, we don't have a single paper on it, in fact. And one of the things I'm thinking about for moving the care agenda forward is sectoral policies on various care services subsectors, which is work that's not progressing. And one last question for Ana Maria. Where does this index stand vis-a-vis the WEF index, the women's empowerment,
global gender gap.
The World Economic Policy Forums? What is it?
The World Economic Forum.
Yeah.
The gender.
Yeah, the gender index by the Economic Policy Forum.
I think she has some. Yeah. Okay, but you next and then.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely amazing. My head is going around with so many questions. But anyways, I have two basic questions, and they have to do both with a need for international cooperation on those matters and certain contradictions that I keep seeing. The first one has to do with the internal contradictions of the climate agenda and the care agenda, and how globally what we see some kind of attempt for global cooperation in finding the space, the physical space, mostly for the green agenda, and that doesn't necessarily is going to go in the same direction as what we need in terms of gender. So I would like to hear all of you in terms of how can we try to bring together those two agendas? Is there any space for that? The second is, as I'm thinking, Raquel mentioned the rise in inequality, and Mary, of course, mentioned incremental change. And in one specific agenda that we've been working a lot in Brazil, which is the tax agenda, I don't actually see an incremental change that is even enough to change the trend that we have on the extremely rapid increase in inequality. And we've been doing a lot of work on trying to support the UN Framework Convention, the Latin American Platform, the PTLAC. And what we observe is that the most that we got so far is the OECD BAPS, the 15% minimum tax, and that's definitely not enough. And there's a huge push for taxes on billionaires right now, which is extremely hard to push for and is not even enough. So my question is, how do we get also global attention to this? Because the whole scenario in Latin America is that we're working our asses off on this. And when we go to the global level, we don't hear as much about it. And we do need a global cooperation to be able to change certain aspects of tax. Because without international cooperation, it's impossible to change the scenario locally as well. Thank you so much.
Okay, before I go to you, I think there might be some online questions, is that right?
There are, yes. We have two questions. One from Jacqueline Velasco. In the last presentation, a gap between the approval of the law and its implementation is identified. Is it possible to analyze, perhaps for a group of representative countries, the causes behind this gap, particularly if it persists over time? Ultimately, what is at stake is the effectiveness and capacity of the state. Thank you. And then a second question is, we talk about unpaid care and well-being and linkages to the paid economy. Is there any work being done on including a model of the shadow black economy or illicit financial flows? And what connections are there with care, which can actually sustain some of these illicit flows and trafficking from a gender, power relations, and justice perspective?
Thank you. Oriel, we'll take two more questions before we turn back to the panelists, and then we can do another round of questions. Oriel, and then Marcella.
Thank you. Yeah, really, this is just a general comment. I very much enjoyed hearing what was said this morning. I just want to say something about the other side of data, microdata. So much of the impacts of what we're discussing, the laws, the policies, are about time in daily life, about, in the end, lived experience. Who has the time, or who doesn't have the time, who has the money, but has the money to buy the time is another consideration. And you know what I'm going to say. I'm going to say we need time use data. We need series of time use data at the international level to look at perspectives on change. It's not just about differences between countries. You know, we know Scandinavian countries and gender equality and the indices and the effect that we see in the distribution of in gender division of paid and unpaid work, but trends, because you know we need to see trends, so we need these data over time, so we can see when inequalities in gender become wider, or when they reduce, because that permits a discussion of what has prompted that. So, for instance, you know, when younger fathers in Mediterranean countries started to do more childcare than their own fathers, you know, what were the implications of that, and why did it happen critically? Because we need to focus on those that we want to promote change. We need to focus on processes of change that have led to these changes at the micro level, and this also involves analysis across levels. You know, it's not just bargaining within households over division of labour in relation to, you know, changing gender consciousness at the micro level, but the changes in fiscal policy and the legal structures at the macro level, and then an intermediate level, the implementation of particular directed measures aimed at specific change. You know, what is the effect on lives? We need to know this as well in order to support these agendas of fiscal and legal and policy changes.
Thank you. Marcella?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, you can. I'm taking seriously Raquel's invitation to bring feminist economics topics into the discussion. And since we had the conference in Rome at the beginning of July, and one of the issues that we tried to address, if I can die, even in defining the topic of the conference, was indirectly militarization. So I think we cannot leave this room without touching this point. Every time we speak about fiscal space, nowadays, we have to consider all the wars that are around the world, and the shift to military expenses in most of our countries. For sure, in my country, Italy, and for sure in the European Union. You know, we are going to have a new commission quite soon, headed by a woman that is really strong in favor of a shift to militarization, unfortunately, I would say. And so fiscal space and militarization go exactly in the opposite direction. So there is certainly a risk in Italy and in our countries in Europe to have new cuts to health, to the healthcare, to the education sector, and so on. So let's try to say something about this in discussing about fiscal policy, please. And second, just for Anna, concerning the gap between perception perception and reality, isn't it the case that the experts are male experts?
All right, so now I turn to the panel for you all to respond to comments, questions. Valeria, we start with you and go this way.
Thank you very much. Before answering, I would like to say that the moment Raquel mentioned that the UNDP has this mandate about poverty, I remember Carmen de la Cruz. Remember when Tom said we were here in this room thinking about LIMTIP? That was a work supported by UNDP initially, and by Carmen de la Cruz. So my remember her and tributing her in that sense. I, of course, agree with Anu, because we've been working on this together, and we've been working because we are in agreement. And I think that's a very important point. And that's why fiscal space, we fought for having fiscal space there in the agreed conclusions in the ILO. It wasn't about gender budgeting or resources for care, blah, 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 blah. It was fiscal space for doing. So we brought that language. And I think it's an entry point, as Anne said, to go beyond the kind of an accounting exercises and to challenge how the economy works. And that's why the joint program we had, we coordinated with Anu, emphasized so much integrated approaches where the employment side, the care, the investments in care, and the macro were thought together. So it's not only about thinking care policies as sectoral policies, which is very much the case, but also thinking more broadly about sectoral policies. And we have done work on gender responsive sectoral policies, along with Marcia Fontana. We've published a tool, and we're working with that with countries. So at least the way I work at the ILO is that it's not about theoretical issues. We go with policymakers to work together in policy implementation. So to me, Ipek, on your question about how ECLAC and how the Latin American experience could be transferred to other contexts, well, as I said, it is being transferred because the presence of Latin American colleagues makes change the global conversations in ways other delegations, like MENA delegations, also change the conversation. So we need them very much. But I think one dimension of the national care services is especially the interinstitutional coordination, that it couldn't be only social protection, it can't be only the women's machinery, it cannot be without the financing ministers. So in that sense, the idea of integration also and coordination is important. I think it can be taken on board in other regions. And again, for the ILO to have that conversation, that agreed conclusions, it's not only governments, it's workers and employers organizations as well. So we have that demand and we act with these actors at the country level. So this is super new. And we've been building the 5R framework for
years. It was published in 2018. It built on work Diana Elson did before with the 3R. So, I mean, things take time. I have one daughter working on the UN task convention, and she is impatient. She cannot believe that things are moving to 2037. I said, yeah, things take time, but it happens. So I think we are in a pivotal moment, and we need now. And in this pivotal moment, we have language about the macro, the physical space, the resources, the resource base written there. So we have to push that. I think I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, about some of the comments, the enforcement, what we wanted to see this time is that part of the enforcement. So that is why we include this new index on a supporting framework. And when we check that supporting framework, where is data, budget, that needs a lot of resources from the country. So it's very close related with the resources that countries have, whether they are high income or low income, and you can see that completely related. Women in courts could help enforce the laws. Yes, there's also a huge correlation between these two, but we don't know what is causing what, no? There's a lot of endogeneity there. And we have been also exploring, because one of the laws that we have been exploring is the quotas in the boards, in the corporate boards. And for example, when we are looking at the literature in that, it's not completely true that having more women in boards are going to improve the situation of women in the private sector, or in the public and private sector. So it seems that it's more to have people that are aware or that are conscious about gender equality in the top. So that is something that we all can work in that. It's important to start like giving all these workshops and information about the importance of gender equality. I know that we are doing this, but in the courts and in the parliaments is key. About bringing gender and climate, I think that is key. We in our project we depend upon grants. We have been seeing that a lot, and I think everyone is looking at the same trend, that a lot of the grants are being allocated to climate. And we need to make this connection, because gender is there, but it's not that clear, the connection. So we have to start showing evidence. That is why we are starting also to work in this paper about laws for gender equality and climate shocks, and what is the relation. I will share that with anyone that is interested in that. About the Global Gender Gap Index, that one has a political empowerment area, yes, but it's more about participation of women in politics. And we also are seeing this connection about, but it's a correlation about more women in parliament, for example, and more gender equality laws. But we don't know exactly what is the connection. We are trying to explore and disentangle that relation. About disaggregated data on paper, we have an indicator of that in our supporting frameworks. And for our sample, the 190 countries, only 24% of the countries have data on that. And about the experts, we were running some regressions to see what characteristics of the experts are improving the score, and being a male improves the score. It's true.
Thank you. So this is going to be a sort of brainstorming answering. Related to the problem of crowded spaces and the UN, and this is something that we discuss a lot. I wanted to flag here, there is a structural challenge at the UN, very well known, and
It's not that it doesn't mean we cannot do anything. It means that what we need to fix is the structure that is bringing many times fragmentation and lack of coordination. But I think there are beautiful examples also of joint work in countries that, as you said, I bet that we need to follow and we need to nurture and we need to learn and we need to continue doing this. So the answer is yes, absolutely. To bring more actors, we need all of us, no? The entire UN. Maybe not the entire, but that's selected kind of, no? Based on added value.
Relevant.
Relevant, yeah. So, second, I think we need, at least myself, to recognize the UN has also limited power when we think, and the lesson learned when we think, what can we do in countries? Definitely the most powerful changer is the political will of government. The parties that are leading the countries and the public policies. So this is the main factor. And I keep repeating ourselves this and myself, because otherwise you become inefficient. It's also a matter of inefficiency. So to keep focus on what can we do, you need also to put, and it's good news. Imagine that we have more power than governments. This will never work. IPEC, employment, UNDP under economics, we do this indirectly through the work on the review of the tax systems indirectly. But we have large programs out of economics on employment generation that we need to engender more and embed more the work that we do in economics, and we go step by step because UNDP is really big. So definitely there is a point there. The climate agenda is coping the space of the financing. I don't remember who said it.
Luisa.
Absolutely, yes. And this is a challenge. And I do not have all the answers, but it's a matter of, at least UNDP, who has big portfolios on climate, it's a matter of opening meaningful conversations with them and helping them to frame their own narrative differently. And it's not easy. It's not easy because those are two different narratives and paradigms, scientific even paradigms, academic kind of different animals, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. And I think on the NDCs, the work on the NDCs, and I am very tough with ourselves also. And some NDCs integrate gender more kind of superficially, but some of them are doing good, are doing very good work. So I think NDCs are the entry point, one entry point. So not in the global discussions, but in countries. I just wanted to say something else, that is enforcing laws, what can we do? And again, I think that we forget a lot how institutions and public ministries operate. The organizational culture is so fundamental, and we don't work on that, we don't talk about it. So it's very good to have numbers, statistics, and all this kind of graphics, but if we don't know how to change mindsets or help to change mindsets of the decision makers, or even the middle ground public civil servants, I mean, the laws are there, nice, programs, nice, but they will keep implementing with the same approach and spirit. Let me give you some really bad news. We have, and Arun, we have another index, even one more, the Social Gender Norms Index, tracking perception using the World Survey value. 90% of the population have one gender bias, women and men, against women's rights, against gender equality. 90%, so it means that maybe 10% here. 39, if I'm not wrong, I'm not a numbers person. 39 think that men should have the jobs in terms of scarcity and crisis. And 42 think that men are better leaders, better decision makers. So if we do not embed this component in every single piece of our, at least, programs and public policies and interventions, it's going to be challenging. I wanted to say that the backlash, just to close, I didn't mention the backlash and backsliding. is another factor that now in middle-income countries in Latin America you were mentioning, in particular, but not only in Latin America, is really cutting programs like from today to tomorrow, cutting social programs and programs targeting the little tiny piece on care and violence and GBV. So we need to put into factor also the kind of global context where we are operating today. That is pretty challenging. Thank you.
Mary?
Thank you. And I think, how much time do I have?
Minute.
A minute? I'm trying to wrap this up. So I'll keep it short. You've already covered so much and a hard act to follow here. I'll focus my comments, I think, on the international cooperation part, which will tie together a lot of different pieces, I think. One is on the issue of enforcement, even though that question was asked at the national level. I do think kind of international cooperation on enforcement is particularly important. And that's a place about, again, I mentioned like data and transparency, being able to report those commitments. We've seen some recent efforts with that, some have been more successful, I think, than others, in terms of getting this type of accountability. But it is, I think, a model to follow and something for us to think about what works well there and kind of analyze that. Luisa, your question, I'm thinking about this all of the time right now, just because there is this internal contradiction. And I think it's really interesting the way that, international development organizations or international financial institutions on the one hand will say, well, when it comes to gender, locally led development. When it comes to climate, we're going to say that this should be the priority, and they will push that forward and say, kind of like put that pressure on countries and also create a lot of incentives, right, to invest in climate finance. And that is crowding out, I think, other areas of finance. And the gender component, I think, again, it's really difficult for us to track this. Right now, I'm doing some research in a paper on gender and climate finance in multilateral development banks. One, we're seeing that what's being tagged as climate is very questionable. What is being tagged as gender and climate finance, even more questionable. So, it's just really difficult to tell, but I will say that this is a very key moment for us to engage in this space in a meaningful way. And COP is upcoming. I think it's been very difficult for gender civil society to make inroads there, but having not just, because I think a lot of the programmatic priorities have been on women's leadership, kind of, scaling up kind of women's climate initiatives, and that's very important. That's an industrial policy component, right? The structural change, we really need to come in, with that, I think, to be able to bring the conversation and dialogue forward. And with the UN kind of tax piece, there's so much excitement and momentum. There's so much excitement about the G20 possibility, and then that got squashed. So this is something, again, I think is a really important time, and progress might be slower than we want, but that's an initiative that was led and led by Global South developing countries, right? It's a different type of space where I think there's a possibility for change that could be much greater. So, again, great opportunity for us to engage. Both the international or illicit financial flows and militarization and connections to fiscal space, completely agree. I think there is a lot of really great work actually being done by some feminist movements on this, making these connections to care, to climate justice, is saying, look, yeah, these are our priorities, and we're aware of how many resources are being, especially global South-based movements, of how much of their resources are being diverted by these things. And what that's doing to the possibility of creating change, but also just to people's lives, right? It's diverting so much resources, especially the illicit financial flows component. And I'll finish up with the time use and the data component. And again, I think this is an area where we need a lot of cooperation to make sure that we're running together data so that we can be aware of what's happening with people's lives. Time use data has been very powerful in some contexts in creating change. I know in Kenya, our partners shared that was the piece that really got the government over the line in thinking about implementing this policy. So where we continue to cooperate in pushing that agenda forward as well. I think, as you said, we have these frameworks, we have the kind of full picture, but now we need to figure out what the most important points of engagement are to make sure that we take advantage of the opportunities that are in front of us and make sure that some things don't get swept away and the momentum of other things.
Thank you very much. We are 4 minutes behind schedule. So I think it's time for our tea and coffee break. My apologies, there were a few questions out there, but please take them up over coffee with our panelists. And thank you all to our panelists for a wonderful, wonderful.